The Newsagents.
It's the election Q&A, and we're going to start with a Q. Dear newsagents, love the podcast, especially now we're gearing up towards a general election. I'm from Anglesey, so my question, is there any other constituency that's been held by 4 major parties at one time or another? Labour, Con, Lib, Plaid, etc.
Ynys Môn. To Welsh listeners at this point, Anglesey is Ynys Môn.
Oh, sorry.
It's fine.
Oh, sorry.
That is the official name of the constituency, of course. Ynys Môn.
Okay, everyone. Were you going to answer the bloody question?
The answer to the question is a lovely question. Love this question. There are right up my street. Look, there are a few that have had 4. It's not. I mean, it's quite unusual. It's not completely unusual. One that might surprise people actually is where it would be true is Brighton Pavilion.
They've never had a Plaid MP.
They've never had Plaid, but they're saying not
They
yet.
get everywhere. They honestly get everywhere.
Ignored the question.
No, I'm
You've been
not.
like a politician.
No. It says by 4 major parties, not just Plaid. This is not just, well, Alan is not being so prescriptive. It's just talking about 4 in general. Otherwise, he's answered his own question, which is Ynys Môn. But Brighton, for example, has had Conservative, Liberal, Labour and now Green. And that might surprise people because, of course, think of Brighton being a very progressive, kind of left-wing sort of place. Even as recently as the 80s, it was a Conservative constituency. Although, actually, on the Plaid point, here's a good one, right? Which is the only, I'm going to ask my own question, which is the only mainland British constituency to have been represented by an Irish nationalist party?
That is not the question.
No, but it's the Plaid. It's the Plaid point, right? It's the Plaid point. It's the nationalist point, right? So it's going back to what John was saying about nationalism.
So hang on. So
British mainland seats.
with an Irish nationalist party.
So this particular seat has been represented by 4, and one of them, so it is answering the question, by 4 different parties, and one of them was an Irish nationalist party.
Which probably isn't a major party.
Well, it doesn't exist anymore. It was an old party which doesn't exist anymore.
I tell you what. If we don't get on with the rest of this episode, and you don't shut up, Lewis Goodall, this episode's going to go past.
The answer is Liverpool, Scotland constituency, which had an Irish nationalist MP until partition and that party dissolved.
Welcome to the newsagents. It's John.
It's Lewis.
It's Emily. Is anyone left? Are you still listening to us?
This is what they want. Give the people what they want.
Oh my God, that's been exhausting.
We've got really good questions to come, as well as Alan's. We've got voice notes. We've got ones from Scotland. We've got people asking about
proportional
representation. Oh, you'll love that. They're all coming back now. Should we kick off with Kate's?
Hey, newsagents. So I wanted to ask how important you think Scotland will be in this election, and what are your predictions for Scotland? Do you think Labour will be able to win back seats from the SNP or not? Cheery bye.
Well, cheery bye. Thank you, Katie.
I mean, I would say, Katie, you've only got to look at how many trips Keir Starmer is making to Scotland to know how important that SNP vote is to him right now. There's been a lot of launches and speeches and visits to Scotland. My sense, and I think Scotland is very, very important to what Labour does overall, my sense is that Labour will not get back as many seats, or get as many seats as they want to. I think the SNP vote, which looked really, really shaky about 3 months ago, might now be hardening up a bit.
Look, are they going to do better than last time? Yes.
Hard to do much worse.
Yeah, exactly. So are they going to get a number of seats? And I think that it depends what time frame you look at. If you say over the last 3 or 4 weeks have things steadied for the SNP, then yeah, absolutely they have. But given the chaos that there has been, the SNP position is much weaker than it was, and that Labour are kind of ticking up the number of seats that they think are winnable in Scotland.
Yeah, I think they'll do well. I mean, the most recent polls and MRP polls actually suggest basically an almost complete restoration of the pre-2015 situation, which is complete Labour dominance in the central belt, and the SNP reduced to 7 or 8 seats, basically going back to their old, far more rural heartlands, which the SNP used to dominate and used to send to Westminster time and time again. I mean, so I think, Labour are feeling very, very chipper about their prospects in Scotland. That means it's really, really important because it makes the task in England much easier in terms of getting a majority. If you don't have that comeback in Scotland, you've got to win seats which are so far down your target list against the Conservatives in England. So it's absolutely crucial.
I would predict that they will probably win back or take back about 10 seats from the SNP, but I don't think it's going to be a wipeout. And the thing that you have to look at with the SNP vote is that a small shift in polling numbers can make a massive difference in terms of the number of seats, because so many of them are so marginal that you could lose on 2% or 3% of the sort of polling margins, you could actually see 8 or 9 seats change hands. I think they'll do well. I think they'll get between, I don't know, I'm going to say 9 and 11. I think I just said 10 seats for Labour. Yeah, but I don't think we're going to see the collapse of the SNP. I do not think that vote is going to go southwards in the way that many people are obviously expecting the Conservatives. Because I think that Swinney coming in at this point, I mean, I would have said this probably under Hamza Yousaf, not for anything that he was particularly doing wrong, but just that there was a sense of the SNP being very much at sea. I think Swinney has come in and sort of taken hold of the party again. It sort of reminded people what the SNP was like under Nicola Sturgeon, and I think he's kind of got the reins back.
But
that's
the polls
all I'm
are getting
going to
worse
say.
for the SNP, the most recent ones.
Well, I mean,
see, Emily, I would say I'm prepared to lay a bet that you're wrong. But seeing as I haven't had a payout yet on getting the election
Well, you wouldn't have done
right,
because you were wrong on your
No,
election
I was
timing.
the closest to it, and I still haven't had the sweepstake money, so I'm not even going to bother to bet with you. I reckon Labour will get far more gains than 10.
okay.
Where are you?
I think that's right. I think they'll end up with between 25 and 40 seats.
All right. We'll
All
come
right,
back to
well,
that one.
we're coming
Katie,
back
you
to
heard
that
it
one.
here.
Katie, thank you very much for that one.
Next question. If voting was made compulsory, like in Australia, and guaranteed us a 100% turnout, how do you think it would affect the outcome of the election? Would it favour any particular party? And that is from Teddy.
Cool, that's a difficult
Well, you're
one.
our oceanic correspondent,
Yeah.
John, aren't you? So I think this is very much in your field.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, what you'll end up with is far more spoilt ballot papers because it is, you resent the fact that you've been told you've got to go and vote. And so you do go to the polling station, but you
Mickey Mouse it.
You Mickey Mouse it. And that is entirely legitimate to do in Australia. So you get a far higher percentage of spoilt ballots. I think that it probably wouldn't make that much difference to the outcome of an election if you forced people to go and vote, because it's like saying that those who abstain normally have a particular political axe to grind, and therefore I don't know, maybe fringe parties would do better.
I tell you what I would say. I've just seen the recent polling from Ipsos from Kieran Pedley, who says that 45% of people have told Ipsos that they may still change their mind. Now, there is a scenario in which if you're not quite sure of where you're going to vote, you might stay at home, or you're not enthused. We always talk about the enthusiasm gap. It is possible that if you find yourself in a booth, or online, I guess in Australia, isn't it? Well, however you have to do it, if you find yourself in a position where you have to vote, you go for one party or another. Whereas if you don't actually have to go there, you remain undecided and maybe back on the sofa, uncommitted to any of them.
In a way, we've got the control, right? We've got Australia, because they've had compulsory voting since 1924, so for a long time, and obviously there's been lots of studies as to kind of the changes it's made. I think it's really interesting because there are two kind of broad areas where it might make a difference. One is to the outcomes and one is to the culture. So on the outcomes, most of the studies suggest that it's probably benefited the left a little bit because they tend to draw their support from more marginalised groups, poorer voters who don't tend to vote, and it tends to be the Australian Labor Party which is against changes to the system, and the Liberal Party which is in favour of it. But I think what's really interesting about Australia is more like the cultural changes it makes. So it means that because there's compulsory voting, it means that the Australian government makes it really easy for you to vote. You can even do it in some cases by telephone. You can vote in literally any polling station across the country. You don't just have to go to your local one.
Like going to a cash point, probably.
Yeah,
isn't it?
and it becomes a really big civic event. They sort of give out sort of hot dogs at the polling stations. It becomes a really kind of big moment for the country. And so because you have to vote and you're punished if you don't, the state basically makes it as easy as it can be for you to vote as possible, which is opposed to where we've been going in our country, in the United States, where we've had...
US particularly.
Indeed, where we've had voter suppression and the state making it harder and harder for you to vote. So in a way, I think the thing that I would find most appealing about compulsory voting is the idea that it basically makes the state make it easier for you to vote and take part in the democratic process.
Totally. I think that we don't need to go down the route of compulsory voting. But what would be absolutely bloody fantastic is if it's not just on Thursday at a polling station. Make it easier for people to vote wherever they want.
Australians do it on a Saturday, for example, again, for that reason, to make it easy.
Why is it on a working day that you have to go and vote? Why not make it the weekend when people have got more free time?
Well, it isn't. I mean, it's from 7 o'clock in the morning till 10 at night, so there's a bit of that where you're probably not working, and it's a postal vote. We will probably be almost in postal voting season, right? So you have got, my mum, who's 92 nearly, will probably do it by postal vote.
A lot of people aren't organised. I mean, we are unusual in having it in European terms. Most of them do it on
the weekend. Yeah, exactly.
I love a Thursday. You're all done by the weekend. Perfect. But I'd also say that it is interesting, to your point, that we are now making it harder for people in terms of the ID. I mean, we've talked little about needing your ID this time. We've just about got used to it for the local elections, for the mayoral elections, but this will be the first time when you may or may not see a drop-off from people who have forgotten, because they haven't been engaged in elections up till now, their ID, and turn up and get, thrown away.
Exactly.
Not thrown away so much as sent away.
Let's hear now from Nick.
Hello, newsagents. This is Nick from Hertfordshire. I think growing up, I was never the kind of election nerd that I imagined that Lewis was.
Correct.
But one thing that I remember being properly interested in was the concept of a safe seat. And I used to always want to know what makes a safe seat, and is there a threshold for something to be categorised as a safe seat? What are the safest seats going into this election? And are there any safe seats that you guys would guarantee would stay that way by the time we get to July the 5th? I hope that makes sense. Hashtag safe seats. Thanks, guys.
I'm glad you got the hashtag in.
I don't know what gave Nick that impression about my youth.
No, because there's nothing geeky about you at all.
That's right.
Nothing.
That's right.
Nothing.
Absolutely.
Not a bit.
Liverpool, Scotland.
Safe seat is somewhere that nothing bad can ever happen to you. Ever.
So I agree. Yeah,
exactly. Where crime is very low.
Yeah, crime's very low.
Is so
People
low
are so gentle with each other,
and
they thank each other.
But it's amazing how sort of demography changes. I mean, from 11 to 18, I lived in Finchley, in North London, Margaret Thatcher's constituency, and it seemed as the safest seat you could ever imagine for the Conservative Party. Now it's kind of, in this election, Labour think they've got a very strong chance of taking it.
Well, Labour won it in 97.
And Labour won it in 97 as well. And so you kind of think that there are these seats that are just, they have to always be that. And like some of the Surrey seats that we've talked about, so Surrey Heath, where Michael Gove is standing down, you think, Surrey Heath, oh my God, you just weigh the majority. You don't actually need to count it, you just weigh it. And those are suddenly marginal seats. I
mean, I remember the 2017 election where we saw Canterbury, we saw Kensington, we saw all these crazy places that had been die-hard blue seats, right, proper Conservative, nailed-on safe seats, suddenly sort of, I think we might have a recount there. We're going to wait a little bit longer to get these because they turned red. And I guess that is the point in a way, Nick, that calling something a safe seat is a bit of a poison chalice, because it sets up this idea that the MP can't possibly lose. And this time round, places that in 2019 we absolutely thought of as die-hard and safe are no longer. So, we talk about the Portillo moment of Enfield South, this idea that somewhere and somebody who we thought could not possibly lose then lost.
Labour's Sedgefield. Tony Blair's constituency.
Yeah. That's why I think so many high-profile Conservatives are now standing down, because they don't want to be this iconic person that should be in the very, very safe seat that then goes.
Historically, you would tend to regard a safe seat as, if you're using sort of pure vote terms, probably as soon as something gets into the 5 figures, so it's 10,000 plus, you would tend to regard that seat as certainly being safe-ish. I think it's absolutely true to say that there is more and more electoral volatility, which means that, as we've seen, if you think about the electoral cycle since 2015, first of all in Scotland, I mean, if we'd been sat here in 2013, say, we would have regarded the Labour seats in Scotland as perhaps the safest in the country. That basically, if you're in those central belt seats, you basically had a seat for life, come what may. We saw what happened. Those seats, as we were just discussing, potentially could now return. So there's way more electoral volatility, but there are still safe seats. I mean, if I were a Labour candidate in, say, Liverpool, Walton, or regard my seat, certainly for this electoral cycle, as being completely safe.
I think Maidenhead, probably, Theresa May's old seat. I think that's pretty... I mean, Henley, Boris Johnson's former seat, is marginal now. Maidenhead, I think, is sort of hard Tory still.
And Henley has actually... I think Henley, there's a couple of seats which have basically been in the Conservative Party's hands since 1885, which is, Third Reform Act, and Henley is one of them. So if Henley were to turn, or if it's being in danger...
Look, we saw Rishi Sunak there this week. Do you remember the Lib Dems had their stunt with the little boat, boat behind Rishi Sunak with all the Lib Dem flags? I mean, the big thing about that moment was not that the Lib Dems put up a stunt, but that Rishi Sunak was campaigning in Henley.
What is Rishi Sunak doing in Henley?
I'll tell you what he's doing. He's fighting off the Lib Dems.
No,
That's
completely.
The point, right?
But that is astonishing.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Sorry, it was rhetorical.
There's a difference.
I didn't understand that.
There's a difference between a question which has a genuine question mark at the end of it and a question that is rhetorical.
And of course, the other thing with safe seats is we were discussing with the Boundary Commission, I think, in the last Q&A. They can just come along and completely change the boundaries. And so in the end, what starts off as a safe seat becomes an extremely marginal one.
Right, this is a really good question from Geeta. Why do the Lib Dems often do so well in the southwest and southwest London compared to other parts of the country?
Very good question.
I think it's a great question. Is it nonconformism?
Yeah, I mean, it is weird.
It's a religious thing of kind of, then not so much the Anglican Church in the southwest, and so you get much more of a nonconformist outlook, and therefore that has tended to help the Liberal Democrats in places like Devon and Cornwall and bits of Somerset.
Yeah, and indeed places in Scotland as well, some of their old heartlands in Scotland as well, particularly in the Highlands and so on. So yeah, I mean, it is really interesting. I mean, I think there's two factors. One is which are sort of linked. One is, you just alluded to it, John, is some of the historical factors around non-conformism, basically not being Anglican, and that was a sort of key part of the old Liberal Party's support base, and it has sort of endured, although the religious question has obviously died away. And that links to the second element, which is basically where the Liberal Party used to have its strongest roots. It did endure despite the fact that it was basically destroyed as a national party in the 1920s, and in particular in places where the Labour Party did not fully supplant it. So the South West is a good example in the sense that the Labour Party's hold on the South West, or viability in the South West, it's always been quite weak in the South West of England, largely because it is so rural. There are very few big urban population centres and very few places historically where the trade union movement was very, very strong, which was basically the kind of centrifuge of the Labour Party. So to some extent, in the South West, the kind of 19th century political setup, i.e. liberal conservative fight, endured through to the 20th century and in a few other places as well.
I also think there's a simpler answer to that, which is that if Labour dominate sort of the cities and the metropolises and, the sort of urban areas, and the Conservatives dominate in mostly the very large rural areas, then the Lib Dems take the suburbs, and the southwest of London is the leafiest of leafy suburbs. If you look at parts of the Cotswolds, or if you look at the other side, Chelmsford, you're seeing places that are generally sort of not quite as affluent as the big rural places, and they're not quite as poor as, the inner cities. But I think the southwest of the country is really interesting because that was always this sort of blue-yellow battle between the Tories and the Lib Dems. If you look at predictions now, that whole tail down into Cornwall looks as if it will go red. It looks as if it will all be taken by Labour, which we haven't seen since before 2010. They were actually quite strong in some of the old mining towns then, got completely pushed out until George Osborne in 2015 frankly stuffed the Lib Dems.
Oh, yeah. And stuffed them brilliantly.
Yeah, and turned that whole sort of coastal area of southwest England blue.
And the other answer is that the Lib Dems, in southwest London in particular, because there's a sort of question is, well, there are other very leafy parts of London. Why aren't they stronger there? Part of it is just sometimes when they get a hold on a place, Lib Dems are great political street fighters. Once they get Conservative and Labour MPs would often sort of get really worried if the Lib Dems like got one councillor somewhere, because they say they're like a virus. You know, they get one seat.
Japanese knotweed. I was just going to say that.
They get one seat, then they take all 3 seats in the ward, then they take the council, and then they come for your seat. They're really good street fighters, and when they kind of get embedded somewhere, they tend to endure and they tend to remain as a sort of fighting force in that place, and that can just be really contingent on like loads of slightly random historical factors.
Maitlis, you and I need to spend less time together if we're going to start finishing each other's sentences.
Japanese knotweed.
I mean, honestly,
we do have that Japanese knotweed club, though. Remember, members only.
We'll be back after the break. Welcome back, and we are now going to hear from Tom.
Hi, newsagents. Tom from Scarborough. A question about proportional representation. At the moment, Labour looking to win a massive majority under first past the post. I've been unable to work out how this election might look if we were in a proportional representation, a PR model. So my question is to you, is how would it look? Or do we simply not know? Do we not have the data to understand how each party might be affected under PR? Many thanks. Love the show.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's interesting, and it also like gets into the question of what comes first. Is it people's voting intentions, or does the system alter people's voting intentions? Because if we had a PR system, it is entirely likely, well, first of all, we wouldn't be where we are now because we'd have had a whole different series of elections up to this point. But also, it's totally possible that you would have seen a left-wing split from the Labour Party. They would form their own party. They would absorb people's preferences and votes. And likewise, you could say the same thing with the Conservative Party. Reform would be even stronger as a potential force. So it's kind of like chicken and egg. And which sort
it's
of comes
Gwyneth
first.
Paltrow getting on or off that tube and the sliding door, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
I mean, I suppose the obvious answer to that is you'd expect the Greens to have more power and you'd expect Reform to have more power. In other words, the parties that get a lot of votes but can't turn them into seats because of the vote distribution, you'd expect that to be different. But actually, I think fundamentally, Lewis, you're right, that we'd see so many more people start their own parties because what have you got to lose, right?
Yeah, but it depends if you're doing it as a national list or a
Regional
partial list system.
Like Scotland,
or
where we still have some
whether you keep 650 constituencies.
Yeah.
If you keep 650 constituencies
And have
and it's
multi-member.
alternate vote, I think that helps Liberal Democrats because you end up, I think, under that voting system with the party that people mind least rather than the party that people want most.
Because it's the
you have to list
throwaway.
your preferences.
Do you remember with the AV referendum, it was the way people tried to explain it was you choose your favourite flavour of crisps, and when that goes, you have to choose your second favourite flavour, and so you end up with the one that most people agree on.
So you end up with plain crisps.
Oh, not me.
Yeah.
But maybe as a country.
Are you a prawn cocktail flavour crisp?
Anything except plain. Can't stand ready salted. Ready salted is a waste of a calorie.
You see, I think this is more
Waste of
interesting
a
than
vote.
well, this is
I
could
mean,
be
a waste
more
of a
interesting
vote.
than our voting system.
Have we
so
done
it really-
AV? Yeah.
But obviously, if you were saying it is pure PR for the whole country, and the polls on polling day are 45% Labour, 30% Conservatives, or whatever it happens to be, then that's how many
And
representatives they will have.
nobody votes tactically, of course, because you just go for your own little, place.
If we were to assume that like the latest polls ended up being translated into whatever parliament we had, and it was PR, and it was roughly proportional, then the result would basically be that Labour would either govern as a strong minority government with support on a case by case basis with Greens and Lib Dems or whatever, or they'd form a coalition with them. It would be as simple as that. There would be no viable. If you were just to take the polling numbers as we've got, put them into Parliament, then there would be no viable right-wing coalition.
But this is why you hear former MPs like Andrew Jenkin, who sounds, slightly kind of shrill, saying this will be the end of any future Conservative government if Labour get in, because the worry for some in the Conservative Party is that Labour will change the system and Labour would always be able to work with other progressive parties in power, thereby keeping the Conservatives out forever. I'm pretty sure that once Labour gets into power, if they get into power, they will never change the system. I mean, they didn't last time round.
Although, of course, if we are genuinely in this Canada 93 territory where the Tories actually get wiped out under first past the post, then they would be wishing we did have PR. Because at least then they would have 20% of the seats on 20% of the vote, or roughly speaking. First past the post has been an incredible asset for the Tory party for basically its entire history. There is a possibility in this election we might be looking at the first time that it properly disadvantages them.
A question from John H. Should Labour include a preemptive rejection of a Sunak honours list in their manifesto? Also, should Labour finally set up a truly independent body to oversee and suggest honours, including the right to take them back if they fail to uphold the values of the institution they represent? There's a kind of number of different bits in that question, John.
Are you talking to yourself?
Yeah, I am.
Not for the first time, of course.
Well, because no one
John
else will
with an
talk to me.
H. John H with an H.
Oh, I'm not going to speak now. I'm going silent. Maitlis, you're starting this.
I think it would be a very easy win for Labour to say we're not going to have leaving honours lists, because they definitely didn't like Boris Johnson's so they probably could do that. And I think they probably should oversee the honours. I mean, we know that Keir Starmer doesn't like the shape of the Lords anyway. He doesn't really like the Lords at all, but they don't want to spend time sort of doing anything big about it. If they did something small but loud about it like this, I think they'd probably get sort of, easy points and spend little time.
I think it would be a great thing to completely reform it, and I don't think there's any chance it'll happen. I think
Exactly.
I mean, Starmer has clearly already basically promised a load of peerages to these Labour MPs who have stood down at the last minute, and they're going to end up in the Lords. So I think
Which is say they are denying this.
They are denying it, but
Right.
I would I'll be amazed if at least we don't see a rush of vermin for at least several of those Labour MPs.
What does that look like, a rush of vermin?
Very
Rush of
fluffy.
vermin.
Fluffy.
Ermine.
I thought you said a rush of vermin.
Maybe both.
Sweet scented. And I just think the incentives for any particular political party, you'd have to be so high-minded to decide to basically get rid of many of the baubles and the patronage that, particularly when you've been out of office for as long as Labour has, and suddenly
There's a lot of people to thank.
Yeah, there's a lot. You suddenly find you've got a lot of people to thank. Should say, of course, Blair and Brown didn't do a resignation honours list, so
But they did stuff. I mean, they did still stuff.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
that
there were a
probably
few
that
people
did
who
help.
appointed to the House of Lords, controversially.
Yeah.
I suppose that it's just that, when if a Labour government wins the general election, and you're going to have this whole list of priorities and everyone's pet project, and you are going to have the most eye-wateringly tight spending round, is Labour going to commit to doing things which are going to take up a lot of time and just bog them down and just slow everything up? And I just think something that looks like an easy win ends up being quite complicated.
Maybe.
And then they just back away from it.
And we've got a final voice note. Well, it says from Tenerife. I'm assuming this is the place rather than the person.
Hi, newsagents. This is Cleo O'Flynn from Adeje in Tenerife. Maybe your biggest Tenerife-based fan. Anyway, my question is relating to the people that I kind of represent. I work for a local town hall where you have over 7,000 British people as residents and regular visitors. And Brexit had a huge effect on them, as I know, because quite often I've had to deal with the fallout. I wonder if you think any of the political parties or any of the politicians are really going to give the after effects of Brexit a second look during the election campaign. Thanks a million for all you do. Bye.
Well, thank you so much. And
Biggest fan in Tenerife.
Yeah.
I wouldn't put money on that. I reckon we've got some more.
you reckon we've got bigger?
Who knows?
I tell you what, I think that's a bloody good question. I think it is absolutely unbelievable how little Brexit is being spoken about in this election. And my prediction would be it's not going to be spoken about in this election, because for all sorts of reasons. For the Tories, it draws attention to failure. For the Labour Party, it says you're trying to reopen old wounds, and therefore, if you're trying to win back the Red Wall, why do it? And so it's just going to get ignored, even though, as you rightly say, there are huge questions about the post-Brexit settlement that is doing Britain great damage.
Even the Lib Dems don't want to talk about it. I mean, it is amazing to consider. I mean, I was watching some of the clips back from the 2019 debate. We've had the debate this week. Obviously completely dominated by Brexit every single way. It did not get a single mention. Even Sunak didn't mention it, right?
I
Because
think
as you
we've
say,
talked
John-
about Brexit more than the parties have.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah,
oh,
no, we
completely.
have.
Without
I
a
mean,
doubt.
this campaign, funnily enough.
Without a doubt. And I think that obviously the really interesting long-term question in British politics is the demographics are clear, the polling is really clear that there is, particularly as you go down the generations, a bigger and bigger majority to, if not rejoin, then certainly look again at the settlement. And the interesting question is, does that in the end exert some sort of political gravitational pull? And that is a sort of received wisdom, or maybe it doesn't. So I'm interested in, for personal reasons, but I think there is a sort of comparison with what happened in Norway in the mid-90s, right? Which is that you've basically got all of the political class, all the political parties in favour of joining, apart from some, joining the EU. And it doesn't happen because it's narrowly rejected in a referendum. And even though most of the big political parties there now kind of do want to reopen it, they don't, because it's almost like reopening those wounds is just potentially politically so problematic for them because it divides their internal coalitions, because the public at large is generally hostile to it. It's interesting that basically, even if you can have basically a large group of politicians who all privately think that something should be looked at, they don't, just because the memory of reopening those civil wars, even going back quite a long way, in this case back to the 90s, they just leave it alone. So it's possible that this sort of weird settlement just kind of endures for longer than we think it does.
I think you cannot overstate the demographics on this one, which is the really dark thing that nobody wants to talk about, which is that more of the people who have died since 2016 have been the Brexit voters, and that more of the people who have got their first vote will be Remain voters. And actually, that will end up dictating, I think, how quickly the parties feel that they can start talking about it. Because when they are looking at a whole generation of people who broadly feel the same thing coming through, becoming first-time voters or second-time voters or even MPs themselves, they will have to start treating this question seriously. It's quite sort of ghoulish to think about it in terms of those who've died and those who are still alive.
But we're going to have to wait a little while, is my answer.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think it's going to happen.
And the EU doesn't want to reopen it either.
No, the EU thinks, oh my God, please.
Yeah.
No. You know, that's the other side of it we don't look at, is the extent to which, Britain might suddenly decide, oh yeah, we got that wrong, can we come back in?
Things have moved on in the EU.
The EU things have moved on.
There's no come back in.
No,
there is no rejoin. There is join.
There is. You join, and you will join on the conditions that they set for you.
Yeah.
Not the conditions we had when we were in.
And they would want to set conditions such that it would become impossible for us to leave again, which almost certainly means the euro. So once you start actually looking at the question of reaccession, it becomes fiendishly difficult, I think.
The euro, Schengen, the whole bit. Yeah. We will be back with one more question after the break. So before we go, this is a great question from Lyndon. If you were running for any parliamentary seat, which would you choose? Maitlis, I'm going to suggest somewhere where it's got to have a lot of good place for wild swimming, good runs, you hate the flat, it's got to have hills.
Ideally, lots of embassies that you can go and spend time in of an evening.
Do we have an MP in Gibraltar? I think that is my perfect constituency, somewhere sunny and quite close to Spain.
Yeah, if we had the French system, where they have all their overseas
territories.
That would be you. Or you could do the British overseas territories.
I'd do all of them.
Yeah, all of them.
Martinique West. We are now joined by the MP for Martinique West, Emily Maitlis.
I think from this you
Princess
understand that I will never, ever, ever stand for high office or low office or any office. I don't even want to be the milk monitor, okay?
Were any of us
available?
Were any of us prefects at school?
No.
I was.
Oh no! Oh my God! I always had you down as the
rebel.
the insurgent.
I was bringing the system down from within.
Oh yeah,
you are as establishment as Nigel Farage.
Oh, that was a good question. I'm glad I asked that.
Go on, where's yours?
I don't know. I'd want to go somewhere that was a lovely part of Britain. I mean, the problem is that you get the most beautiful constituency.
Got to go to Yorkshire then.
Western Isles,
Westmoreland and Lonsdale,
and then Westmoreland. But then you're slapping up and down to Westminster, and you think, oh God, it's a long way away.
You should just be like, leave me here.
Well, so whereas if you get City of Westminster, if you're the Westminster MP, God, you don't have any.
Ross, Skye, and Lekeba. That's got to be the best. That's got to be the prettiest.
I tell you what, Naharil and Anar, which, as you will know, is the Western Isles, is Angus O'Neill's seat for the SNP. I was looking at a projection of that going red this time round for Labour. I don't think I've ever seen Labour that high up or that far off.
It used to be Labour.
Okay, not for a long
while
time.
ago, but in the new Labour
that'd be
years.
quite pretty.
That's very
that'd be lovely. Yeah.
I mean,
but not if you had to get down to the House of Commons every Wednesday.
Well, Ian Blackford, who's the MP for Ross, Skye and Lekeba, had told me that he has to drive from Skye, where he's got his croft, and it takes like 3 hours to drive to Inverness, which is basically the closest airport.
Yeah.
And then you have to fly back down. So I mean, it is
a trek.
Yeah. I mean, back in the 80s, I mean, you remember, John, all the Scottish Labour MPs used to get the same train together. From Edinburgh and whatever.
Yeah,
There used to be a whole carriage full of them, whatever. You should have the prettiest constituency name, which I think is South Holland and the Deepings. But that is a very, very...
And it's not in South Holland, which is... It's sort of Lincolnshire.
Amsterdam.
It's
full of tulip fields.
Just by Utrecht. It's fantastic.
Tulips and dogs. That's all.
And windmills.
Perfect. Have some Gouda on the way across.
Right. We will be back on Sunday. Yes, Sunday. Our new Sunday show.
And we've got a special report on Sunday.
And we've got a special
report from the Northwest.
Yeah, from Lewis Goodall. We will see you then. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.